desperately need to get together and let our voices be heard.
This is Buffalo What's Next. I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Dave Debo.
And I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
After May 14th, how can we afford not to talk about race?
About education, about segregation, about humanity.
Since the dawn of this nation, racial violence has existed.
The way we have designed our society has a big hand in what occurred in that Tops Market.
The suburban area, everywhere. We must work and teach our children.
We need to make sure that we put more funding in our programs that help prevent gun violence and more money into art.
If we're going to have some real healing, we've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truth.
And good morning. Welcome to Buffalo What's Next. I'm Jay Moran, and for the next hour, we're going to be talking with Professor Micheal Niman from Buffalo State. He joins us this morning. We've got a lot to cover here in the next hour. We'll get into a lot of cultural issues regarding race, also bring them back home here to Buffalo. Professor Niman, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So much to talk about, and you've done extensive writing both on a local level and on a national level as well about a lot of these different issues, and a couple that we just want to use maybe as things to start off our conversation. The idea, and we've touched on this a little bit, but it's so, I think, important to understand, is the generational wealth disparity that we see between blacks and whites. Obviously, it's here in Buffalo, in one of the poorest cities in America, one of the most segregated cities in America. But it's a larger issue that has really interesting historical roots.
Yes, and I think it's also very important not just to look at those roots, but to look at how that wealth gap was portrayed. And, part of this construction of, white superiority, right? White supremacy has a narrative that you blame the victim. But if you look at this, and this is something that's really interesting to teach, because so many students of color, come into the room blaming their families for their economic struggles and not really understanding and saying, I don't understand, my dad works 2 jobs, my mom works 2 jobs, and yet, I'm still having to take out loans and work to go to school, and I'm still falling in debt, and I'm still suffering this, this economic disadvantage. And I always blamed my parents. The example that I use is I like to talk about, for instance, just so many systems are in place. I'm really glad that Ibram X. Kendi was here to talk a lot about, racist policy. And how it's much more than people. It's policy that really puts this on a kind of economic autopilot. There's another scholar by the name of Reitmeyer. She's an economic historian, and she examines, how these are really, these are loops, these are feedback loops that are locked in to our economy. One, for example, that makes a very, very big difference is real estate. And, for most Americans, real estate is their main asset.
Right. An average white American would most likely have a home, and that would be their source of some sort of wealth or some sort of equity.
Right. And equity is a very important thing because it also enables, credit. And if you have equity and you have credit, then suddenly everything is much more affordable. If you don't have credit, which is oftentimes tied to that equity in real estate, then suddenly, your credit card rates are really much higher. I don't mean like 50% higher, but might be 3, 4, 5 times higher. Much more likely to go into default because you don't have the cushion of real estate. But let's look at this historically, okay? So, and the example I really like to use is, Levittown, Long Island. So you have World War II ends, and all of the GIs are coming back home. And we have the GI Bill, and we have, the government, the FHA programs. And these two things kind of tied together to create easy money for GIs, for veterans coming back from World War II, to buy homes in these newly developing suburbs. And this is all funded, with federal money. So I like to give the example, because my dad, was in World War II. So my dad comes home. He actually didn't buy one of these houses, but, a white GI comes back after fighting in the war and surviving the war and so on. They come back, and a black GI comes back. Similar histories, similar economic statuses. They both live in New York City. They both rent apartments. And the GI Bill comes along, and what the bill is giving them is it's giving them a no money down, low interest rate mortgage to buy new houses in these newly developed, suburban subdivisions, which is being sold also as the American dream.
Right, and Levittown basically didn't exist until that time.
It was a potato field, right? So Levittown, and I use Levittown because it's the template for everything that was being developed all around the country in every major metropolitan area.
You can see it here. I mean, you historically can see it here in Hamburg and in West Seneca.
Yeah, and more Cheektowaga, your first ring in suburbs. So what they would get is they would get a house in Levittown, a brand new house, low maintenance. You're good to roll for 20 years without thinking about a roof or thinking about plumbing. And the house would come basically equipped. So it came with a refrigerator, right? It came with, had a driveway, had a garage. This is the American dream. So your house comes, basically equipped, move-in condition, grassy backyard. And what they were paying turned out to be much lower than what they were paying in rent. Now, that white GI gets that money and moves out there, but it's not available to the black GI. And, the reason being, because the government, said, and we're still looking at the remnants of the New Deal and so on, New Deal actually had lots of racist policy, lots of racist economic policy built into it. But they said, this isn't racism. We're not prohibiting black folks or anybody based on identity from getting one of these loans. The loans are available to everybody, but you could not get the loan in an integrated community or an integrating community. They had to be for segregated communities. Now again, they backed around. They said, well, this is just basically, we want this pool of money to last intergenerationally. So we want people to buy these houses. We want the real estate to appreciate. We want them to pay down their mortgages, and then they can, pay back the money. The money's there for the next generation. And if you look historically, and they're actually accurate, in integrated neighborhoods, the property doesn't appreciate in value. In fact, sometimes depreciates in value. That's based on a lot of things, right? Absolutely racism, but it's a racism driven by fear. And what are they afraid of? Well, one of the main things people are afraid of that drove white flight was they're afraid that the property values would decrease. Now, also, there are other people who are just outright racists. But overall, the property values did have a higher likelihood of decreasing because people believed they would. So you had this feedback loop. So the government said, well, we just can't lend money into a community where we can't really, see stable property value increases. And they quickly defended themselves. But, if there's any new black subdivisions being built, of course we'll lend money. Of course, there were no new black subdivisions being built because the people that supply the capital, the developers and so on, were not building new black subdivisions. So basically, the black GI was closed out of this program, which was funded by our tax money. So the white GI gets a house in Levittown. The black GI continues to be rent in the Bronx. And, what happens with rent over the course of 10 years? Rent keeps going up. So the black GI's rent keeps going up. That keeps eating a bigger and bigger portion of his family's budget. The white GI's rent stays the same because it's a fixed rate mortgage. 20 years go by, could be 15, could be 30, but basically 20 years go by. What happens? The white GI's mortgage is paid off. The black GI's rent has gone up for another decade and is still higher. And then you fast forward, okay, now the white GI, the veteran, not GI, veteran, now the white veteran, lives another 10, 20, 30 years not having to pay a mortgage. Where does that money go?
Savings,
and also goes into the children's education, being able to help kids go to college, things like that. So this starts affecting college, which is another driver of intergenerational, wealth, inequity. So fast forward some more. Eventually, you get around to a time when what are World War II veterans doing? Now they're old and they're dying. So what happens when that white veteran dies? Well, there's this house in, Levittown that's been paid off. What's that worth? Right? And $500,000 conservatively. My students always correct me, and say, no, 700. So whatever that's worth, where does that money go? It goes to, it goes to the next generation. What are they? Who are they? What are they doing? Well, they're parents whose kids are about to go to college. So, or, and now even beyond that, this is even a generation removed from that. So they suddenly have this equity coming in their parents' home, and they can afford to subsidize those kids going to college. What's happening to that black GI, veteran, who passes on? Well, if his family's lucky, they get to take over the lease in a rent-controlled apartment, and there's no equity there, and there's probably some kind of debt associated. Now, there's no difference between these two men. And there were men at
they
that
both
point,
served.
right?
Both served in the war.
Right, and everything else, both being equal education, similar professions. The only difference is one was white, one was black. Now, move forward another generation, what's happened to that wealth? So you can see how this wealth isn't just there, but it keeps expanding and expanding and expanding, because ultimately in this society, the people who make money through investments, not through labor.
It's interesting that you talked about how this was the American dream in the late 40s, early 50s. Not only did it play itself out, right, but it became so much a part of the myth of America, right? That this white community, these are the backbones of America that are working hard and building homes and building communities across America, right?
Right, but this myth, okay, which I really like your use of the term myth, because it was a myth. Just like nostalgia is a myth. Do you really want to go back to the 1950s? Do you really want to go back to the 1960s, right? But it wasn't a myth for people of color. It wasn't a myth for, who were locked out of this dream. It wasn't a myth for people who this dream could be a nightmare. And, again, it was living on the East Side. It was really eye-opening for me to see how many of my neighbors did not want to go to the Galleria Mall, did not want to go to the suburbs, felt uncomfortable for good reasons. A friend of mine who, owned a business on the East Side moved to Cheektowaga and moved back 3 years later because of police harassment, So, not only was this not a dream, and not only was it a myth, but, it was an exercise of privilege. And that's another important thing is that, there's an equation. If somebody's getting a job they weren't qualified for based on some kind of a social bias, and we see that all the time, then somebody who was qualified for that job didn't get that job. So that, wherever there's somebody receiving a privilege, there's the other part of the equation where somebody is, at a disadvantage. And when you look at there's this really interesting sociological study, and sociologists have done great work where they would send, two candidates, one white, one black, give them equal resumes, send them out, applying for similar or the same jobs. And the only difference was that they put a felony conviction on the white person's, not resume, of course, but in the white person's background. And those white people, and they were fake identities.
Sure.
They were offered jobs more so than the black person who had equal credentials but did not have that felony conviction. And when they then went back and they interviewed the people, why'd you make this hiring? And they, absolutely, I am not a racist. And this is your new enlightened racism, right? It's unfashionable to be a racist. So people just lie to themselves about their racism, and they always make up some kind of other excuse. I don't know really what it was. This is the quote. I don't really know what it was, but I just seemed.
I like candidate A better than candidate B.
He just seemed more trustworthy. So that when I was an adjunct at UB in the 1980s, I had a student who was part of a shoplifting ring. Two white kids 3 black kids, and they'd go into department stores, and the 3 black kids would just like kind of go in and scatter in different directions, and that would keep the security guards busy while the 2 white kids just kind of cleaned up with small. There's technology that prevents that today,
Right.
RFID chips and so on. But back then, they were kind of putting themselves through college, splitting it all 5 ways. And so think about that racism of these, and we all know, shopping while black, right? Think of the racism and how it hurts the businesses who are actually practicing that racism, because they're making bad, stupid decisions based on that racism. Now think of the people who are hiring and have this internal bias that they are in denial about. They're making bad, stupid decisions as well, and they lose also because of that. People think about people who just see the threat in a black body. Think evolutionarily that doesn't work because they have poor threat assessment skills. They can't see where the real threats are because they're confused by their own racism. But yeah,
is that a larger? Could be taken to a larger level. That so much of America is fine. And we can touch on this replacement theory that we heard so much about that was behind 514. People are worried about a threat that's not really there, and not paying attention to a larger, perhaps a power control
and
right?
destroying themselves because of it. And so that if you look at how people vote. People vote against their own best interests over and over and over and over again because of some mythological fear that, well, maybe a person of color might benefit from this too. So, now there's a lot of questions. Is this deep-seated hatred? And some people it is. And most people it's, that they're being manipulated, but And they're always victimizing themselves. And if you look at the creation of the white race, which I'll get to in a minute, was created as a social control mechanism, and it was used throughout our history. If you can keep the white steel workers and the black steel workers who have equal concerns working into the same conditions, substitute any industry, right? If you can, naturally they're going to unite, and they're going to organize. So race comes into play as a method of social control to keep people from organizing. And ultimately, what they do is they undermine themselves, the white folks and the black folks are both hurt by, not having that unity. I got to really stop for a second, though.
Sure.
And say that, yes, white racists hurt themselves with their racism, but there's also part of me, and I'm not really, proud of it. And part of me says to hell with them, because the people who are really being hurt, that's where we really have to focus on. There's a whole narrative on why some kid from Conklin, is raised to be so screwed up that he comes here to terrorize, Buffalo's black community, and I'm just. That terror is there. You don't need a white person to come here and tell you about it. That's not why I'm here.
Understood.
Right. I can't think about him. This is not about white people, when he comes here and does this. But to look at it on a macro level, white people who buy into, racist fear wind up doing things, particularly in the voting booth, that undermine their own self-interests. So, I go back to when George W. Bush was elected, gay marriage was put on the ballot, or bills outlawing, same-sex marriage, not just gay marriage or same-gender marriage, gender non-conforming marriage. Bills were put on the books just to get people to come out to the polls to vote against,
against
same-sex
one issue,
marriage rights, one issue. And no, so you think about somebody, okay, back then, right? And that's where, globalization was really hitting, economies in the heartland hard. So you live in a small town, in the middle of the country. Your downtown is all boarded up because the Walmart sucked up all the businesses, selling cheap imported stuff from China. Your factories are closing down. Your jobs are disappearing. You're facing intergenerational unemployment. Your kids are going off and not coming back. Your world is disappearing around you. But you're more concerned that the loving couple down the block might get married. I mean, what kind of insanity is that? And that is, that turned out to be fear. And now we have, same-sex marriage. And what we have are stronger families. We have, it's really, stronger family values. None of these people keep getting this bill of lies. None of it ever comes true. It's just fear, irrational fear. And it's also not, not built into the human so-called nature, right, which is a problematic word. So we can talk more about that.
Let's take a quick time out here. We'll catch our breath, and we'll come back. We've got a lot to talk about here. Professor Micheal Niman from Buffalo State with us on Buffalo What's Next. We'll be right back.
Watch Remembering Crystal Beach Park.
Crystal Beach was such an important part of the lives of anyone growing up in the Western New York or Southern Ontario area.
Relive those childhood memories with the WNED PBS original production Remembering Crystal Beach Park. Now streaming on YouTube and the PBS video app.
This is Buffalo What's Next, where we have conversations with the community about moving forward. To have your voice heard, press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions and comments on the air. Join us on Twitter @WBFO or email us at news@wbfo.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
And welcome back to Buffalo What's Next. I'm Jay Moran. With me, Professor Micheal Niman from Buffalo State College. We're getting into an expansive conversation about a variety of issues that all really kind of are at the core of what we've been talking about on Buffalo What's Next here. And one thing you wanted to get into, the invention of the white race. I mean, just the idea that it was invented. Expand on that, please.
Yeah, it's an identity, and it's invented, and it's in flux, right? I'll talk more about that. But, it's a socially defined category, and it's basically defined by power. It is part of the construction of a power dynamic. There's a really excellent, very in-depth 2-volume, like 400 pages per volume, work that was published in 2012 by a historian of race in the United States, Theodore Allen. And it's called The Invention of the White Race. He looks at the British treatment of the Irish prior to colonization to lay down the foundation for understanding anti-black racism.
Interesting.
Okay. In that, the Irish were not white. But if you look at, Brits and Irish today, it's like, what does this mean they're not white? But they were definitely not white, and hence they could be treated and they could be abused and their labor could be stolen. Ultimately, that disadvantaged British workers who were, because suddenly they are now competing against a really exploited labor force that drives down wages for everybody. So that Allen looks at that, and kind of like lays down his work based upon that. And he starts looking at historical records, and he finds that the first Africans, and of course, now it's pretty well known, arrived in Virginia colony in 1619. Hence the fantastic 1619 Project. He points out when the first Africans showed up in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people there. White in quotation marks, right? There are no white people there. Nor, according to colonial records, would there be any white people there for 60 years. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't, British colonists there and the British gentry and so on and slave owners. But we didn't refer to them at the time. I use the we very liberally.
Sure, understood.
Right? Nobody referred to them as white. That term didn't exist. Allen found, no instances of any official use of the term white to refer to social status, to refer to people, before the word was used in a law in Virginia in 1691. So 72 years after the first, colony, after the Virginia colony is established, after the Virginia colony is established, we see the word white in 1691. And he said that white identity had to be taught. to people. The reason why white becomes important is you need to look at the Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion, right, of 1676, 1677. That was the first stab at an American Revolution, 100 years, before the American Revolution that we know about. And that ultimately, what Bacon's Rebellion was it was Irish indentured servants, nearly slaves, right? You're going to work this lifetime for, your child's freedom and right? So it was a rebellion of white indentured servants, almost all, Irish, and African slaves, and then Black American second-generation slaves, right, who got together and nearly overthrew the colonial government. And they were put down. But that scared the white gentry minority, the moneyed white minority who owned the colony, who owned most of the property, who owned people, and who owned the labor of other people. That scared them because they were a minority. And they said that something has to be done to undermine that unity. And that's when they started giving some white privilege, doling out some crumbs to the Irish indentured servants and the children of the Irish. And ultimately that caused distrust between the black folks and the Irish. Because, one had privilege and one didn't. And even though the privilege was hardly privilege, it was just maybe a little bit less oppression, right? Right. But so it goes like this, the black folks are, the black folks are looking at the Irish and saying, their children think that they can own my children. And we can't trust them. And that, and now they have this other commonality, and now they're allowed these privileges, and they can do these things, so they're starting to look more and more and more like the oppressor. And the Irish are looking at the black slaves, and they're thinking the same thing. I can be a rich white person. My children can own black slaves, right? So this brilliant, deviously brilliant construction of whiteness stopped the real American Revolution. When we get American Revolution 100 years later, that comes at a time when the British start abolishing slavery or allowing slavery to be abolished in various colonies. And the writing was on the wall, and, you started to have, a stronger movement talking about, slavery, and various, different Christian sects are seeing it as being immoral, and they're starting to set up a beachhead over here. So, that revolution, some historians will argue, many historians will argue, one of the driving factors was to break from the British before the British abolished slavery. And it's really important to understand slavery wasn't just the theft of black labor, but the American banking system was heavily built upon the equity of black bodies. So slaves were commodities in colonial law, and slaves were commodities in American law after the Revolution. So not only is your freedom, your labor, being stolen, not only are you treated like a thing, can you be raped and so on legally, but the acquisition of land and more land and tools by plantation owners was made possible using slaves as collateral. And that collateral started making up a very large chunk of the equity upon which our banks were built. So banks today, in essence, the same banks oftentimes, right, were built on the equity of black bodies. If you abolish slavery, you abolish that equity, you crash the economic system, suddenly this is baked in. So this horrific barbarism is now the foundation of the economic system. And it goes more that slaves were not, the stereotype that all slaves were field hands, right? And of course, being a field hand is skilled work. Agriculture is skilled work, but it goes beyond that. Senegalese engineers were captured and sold into slavery, and they were worth a lot of money because they were engineers. And they brought with them an engineering system that kind of revolutionized how things were built in the United States. There's a plantation tours in Louisiana are horrific. People getting married at a plantation. It's like being married in Buchenwald, or Auschwitz. These are, for Black Americans, these are concentration camps. Horror has happened there. But there's this one slave plantation that it's called the Laura Plantation in Louisiana near the Mississippi River. And it's won all kinds of awards for its, as a museum. When you go there and they will show you the interlocking beams with numbers on them, that this manor house was a kit that was pre-made and then pieced together. It survived floods. It survived fires. It's been there for hundreds of years. It was engineered by slaves. And it gets more complicated. And that many of this talent was involved in building the Capitol. So, and then it gets, if you look at that plantation was run by Creoles. Well, who were Creoles? Creoles were people of African descent who rose in social class to have liberties and freedoms, not all of them, and be slave owners. And what was their main commodity? They bred slaves. So that also shows that, and they slipped into a sort of, netherworld between being Black and being white. So racial identity, was in slavery times, connected to social class as well. So it gets really complicated, but yeah.
And it's interesting that you bring that up because I recall a conversation we had about 6 weeks ago or so with a national author, Anthony Bazil, was in town with the Land Conservancy, and she got into the idea and expresses in one of her books about how some of the main agricultural drivers on these plantations were Africans who had knowledge of how to grow certain products that there was no knowledge of here in North America. So, I mean, there's more and more of this. I guess what I'm getting at here is the idea that there's so much of what has become generally accepted knowledge about and almost has reduced the people who were enslaved for so long that it builds this kind of characterization that no skills, the superior people were the people who thought and developed these plantations on their own. I mean, it's a construct, it seems, that's still living today.
Right. And, and the racists themselves, so much of their culture comes from Africa. The banjo is an African, so you start looking at that, stereotype of somebody living back in the hills playing the banjo, white folks, again, so much of American culture and American knowledge, stems from Africa. So, yeah, but they had to deny that. They had to deny that. This country was built on big lie after big lie, that being one of them, because you have people and, how in a so-called Christian society do you legitimate this? I don't really have language to describe such human rights abuses. There's nothing as horrific, as at the transatlantic slave trade,
right.
Which began with Columbus bringing back Native Americans, because he didn't get gold in that first trip. So he tried, but I got these, right? Brought back a few Indians and some parrots and institutional, rape and so on. But, that transatlantic slave trade was just so horrific. How do you justify that? The only way to try to justify that is to try to create this myth that the people, your victims, have no humanity.
That you're there to educate and save the souls of these people.
Right. And it's even uncomfortable to even quote that historically.
Right.
And the othering, of the people who are the victims of this. And at that point, the U.S. economy, by the time the revolution happens, and then well into the 19th century and to some degree, and well beyond that, the economy is totally dependent upon this continued exploitation.
We could probably move this forward considerably because you got involved in these conversations, Buffalo conversations on pluralism and identity. I don't know, I didn't quote it exactly correctly, but
yeah.
But it does show again how there is an ignorance of understanding about things and how so developed attitudes are and so have become so embedded in the American thought.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it ignorance. It was the Conversations Project was really interesting. It was under the Clinton administration. It was funded by the federal government. It was National Endowment for the Humanities sponsored it, and it was conversations taking place in a number of American cities. It was called and ours was called the Buffalo Conversations on American Pluralism and Identity, and we ran it through with ECC as the host institution, and we had delegations from each of 8 different ethnic, racial, communities. And when I say communities, there are so many communities within each so-called, identity. So we had 8 different delegations, and they would each host physically and visit physically every other delegation in this round robin of meetings, and then come together for bigger meetings. And the idea was to discuss American pluralism and identity. And the NEH gave me a template to start, to work with, which is we show a film, like, an hour documentary, and basically talks about culture in the traditional sense, music, food, song, dance, and then we just have a conversation. And the model as it worked around the country is, you look at these films and they talk about people's music and dance, and everyone's like, oh, I love Italian food, I love soul food, I love your music, I've been to an Italian wedding, and then the night's over. We had, just to give one example, we had an Irish-American delegation hosting a black delegation, a black and African-American delegation, primarily from the east side of Buffalo, at the Irish Center. And when we went there, we started out with I love your music, I love your food. And, then, somebody asked the question, this is the first time I've ever really been inside of a building in South Buffalo. And then everybody else in the black and African-American delegation said, yeah. And then it's like, and I've always been uncomfortable driving through this neighborhood. And then right? And there's a lot of recognition. And I see that there's not really any black folks living here. And I know the apartments, and Griffin was mayor back then, right? So
right.
Like, the streets were like newly paved.
Absolutely.
And stuff, right? And like this neighborhood looks beautiful. And I know that housing here is affordable, but there's no people that look like me in this neighborhood. And, the Irish folks, they're like, well, it's like, we have big families, and like oftentimes a relative rents a house, or if a neighbor's house goes up, word of mouth, you don't have to advertise it, it gets filled, and then there's like a long period of silence. And then the conversation begins. And we were there, the building was supposed to close. The maintenance people came in, right? Waited. About midnight, there was lots of hugging and exchanging of phone numbers. At that point, I realized that, and it was either that meeting or a different meeting like it. I realized that, I have to do away with these films and just cut to the chase and change the whole format of it. And ultimately, when the NEH made its report to the Congress and the president, which was published as a book, the Buffalo projects were highlighted. The Buffalo project was highlighted, and front and center because of where these conversations went. And what we basically had was, I've never been here. I've never been, and it got really interesting. I remember when the Hispanic and Latina, delegation was meeting with the Black and African American delegation. And you have different people in the delegation from time to time, and then the delegations would meet themselves in larger groups and discuss them. But when we were having that meeting, at some point it came up, and one of the women who was Puerto Rican said, I've never been in the house. I've never been in the house of a black person. And then there's like a long, uncomfortable silence. And, when I teach classes, I've come to embrace that long, uncomfortable silence because people are thinking. And they're thinking before they're going to talk, which is always a good thing. Right? So there's this long, uncomfortable silence. And then, one of the black folks said, and back then, the Hispanic community is primarily Puerto Rican, at least as it was seen by non-Hispanics. And one of the black folks said, "I've never been in the house of a Puerto Rican," more uncomfortable silence. And then I said, "Why is that?" And more uncomfortable silence. And then somebody laughed and said, my mother told me not to go into the house, not to go hang out with black people because they'll shoot you. Mm. And then one of the folks from one of the Hispanic woman laughed and said, "No, I'm sorry." The black woman laughed and said that my mom's always told me not to hang out with Puerto Ricans because they'll cut you.
Wow.
And then there's more silence, and then I said, "Where did these ideas come from?" And then the room just came alive for the rest of the night. TV. It came from American television, where not only are white people learning to fear black people, based on stereotypes created by white people who think that they're liberals in Hollywood, but just create fear out of their own minds, or recesses of their own minds. What does fear look like in their minds? Not only is it white people learning to fear people of color, but it's people of color learning to fear each other and themselves, and we're all poisoned by this. And that night was just going on and on and on, talking about and dispelling stereotypes people had of each other. So these were fascinating. And then also similarities. The Irish, I was just totally blindsided, and I shouldn't have been, having a PhD in American Studies, but, blindsided by how much kinship there was, literally, between the Irish delegation and the Native American delegations, right? In that, well, they both faced the same oppressor. They both faced British colonialism, brutal British colonialism, and then they have similar clan systems, similar, ideas about stewardship of the land, similar ideas about sharing the land. And again, so we just don't talk to each other. And our understandings of each other in a hyper-segregated city like Buffalo come through the media. And, I don't want to use this monolith, the media, because here we are, you're the media, I'm the media.
Right.
But it comes from media. And
perpetuating
and most of the people
lines.
who are perpetuating those storylines, at that time actually considered themselves to be liberals. But they were just telling the stories that were in their head. And that's why you have to diversify the voices that tell the stories, because we have all of this baggage within us.
We're going to take a time out. Just hold it right there. I hope everyone can let that seep in just a little bit as we take this break. This is Buffalo What's Next on WBFO.
This is Buffalo What's Next, where we have conversations with the community about moving forward. To have your voice heard, press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions and comments on the air. Join us on Twitter @WBFO or email us at news@WBFO.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
And we are having a very fascinating conversation, and one I think that is needed, with Professor Micheal Niman of Buffalo State College. This morning, we ended that break, and I think at an appropriate moment, just talking about, like you said, these conversations that emerged in these situations where people basically talked about there was a lot of honesty, it sounded like to me, and a lot of revelation about attitudes about race. I'm wondering, that was back in the Clinton administration. So I'm going to push this forward to right now. And I ask this to a lot of our guests. What about hope? Are you hopeful about how things can be moving forward? And I think I already know your answer,
right,
but go ahead.
Well,
I'd like to hear you expand on it.
My wife always warns me about hope. Mm-hmm. Right? You can be really careful with hope, because hope will always usually let you down. And, and I'm not very good, if you look at my writings, I'm really good at identifying problems rather than, solutions, right? A lot of journalists kind of, background investigative journals get into that kind of but hope, what came out of the conversations was hope. That here you have, people that are the community leaders, in a very segregated community, in an extraordinarily segregated, metropolitan area, are suddenly embracing the people that they've feared intergenerationally. So when we meet each other one-on-one, there's hope. But, doing workshops on microaggressions, there's hope, but people carry so much baggage.
Right.
And it's really difficult to move beyond that. And that, we could, and then also, we could get away with, we could eliminate, hypothetically, let's say there was just like somehow some magic miracle kind of thing, right? And that racism as a conscious belief system was eliminated. The effects of racism would continue to go on intergenerationally unless we also change those institutions. So, I do have hope, right? But it's difficult. So, for instance, if talking with my students, I said one of the major, institutional mechanisms that drives intergenerational racial wealth disparity is the disparities in our education system. You look at the Buffalo metropolitan area, which basically it goes on to Erie County, and you look at how many artificial political divisions, how many lines are drawn on maps, how many different governments exist, and they all fund their school systems from property taxes, so that the wealthiest communities spend so much more, per student for students who already have so many advantages, and that poor schools are impoverished. And you see the results of this when I start seeing students come into Buffalo State from school districts across the state. Some come in with the benefit of 7 classes of advanced placement courses, and others come in having to take 0 to 100 level remedial classes that financial aid doesn't pay for, that they don't get any credits for. So there's this disparity that stems from education. So I pose this question to my students. Hypothetically, I go, the funding of education is an institutional barrier, the way we fund education, to racial equity. How about if we just had one school district encompassing the whole county? It would still be a fraction of the size of, school districts in places like Chicago and New York and maybe L.A.
Right.
It wouldn't be absurdly large. And that we take the property taxes also. We not just have one school district, but basically have one municipality, county-wide, and everybody pays taxes to the county, and that money is divided per capita to school districts across the county. And all the students, that would be a great idea. Why can't we do that? And then I ask it to them personally. Okay, who lives in Orchard Park? Who lives in, and I do. And okay, so if you're still living there and you have children, would you really vote to do that? Because it would cause a very serious lowering of equity. It would cause a lower quality of education for your children, because that money would be equitably shared among all children, as opposed to, that privilege would disappear. Then you'd have equity. Would you still vote for that? Would you support it? And people are really good about being dishonest. Right? But some, and that really causes them to think. And that's the problem. Then we get into you're hardwired to care for your offspring, right? I'm like, does that mean, right? So there are so many things working against us that, don't rely on hope. But you're not going to have anything without hope. And one thing I got to say is that, unrelated, somewhat, I'm working on a food systems project, a research project, a sabbatical project, partnering with my wife, who also is working on it. And we're looking at people who are involved in projects in the food system, basically decolonizing the food system, that see their work as being social justice. And we're looking at various different projects from seed all the way to table, and what the surprising thing is, everybody we've interviewed have just blown us away with giving us hope that there are fantastic people out there doing amazing things.
Certainly.
In the food system, right? and that there are people, we are having this conversation on WBFO. I'm sorry, but, it wasn't that long ago that we would not be having this conversation on WBFO. So we've come a long way. And that language that I'm using here, which you're familiar with and most of your listeners are familiar with, was alien not that long ago. When we're talking about, about various types, institutional racism, racist policies, we're talking about it. So I'm hopeful, but people are very quick to engage in performative allyship and performative anti-racism until it comes to actually confronting that they have privilege and that for there to be equity, a level playing field means that they might have to give up some of their privilege. And, so let's see how far hope goes.
Right.
Right. But we get people talking about these things, but that's the solution is going to be some fundamental changes and that they're not going to be popular. But the people, who would have thought? I'm really inspired by how far we've come with LGBTQIA, rights in my lifetime. We have
recent lifetime.
We have a long way to go, but how quick, right? And that, as a matter of fact, yeah, absolutely. There aren't that many people who are even, will blink, at a loving same-sex couple. There are big pockets of hate, geographic pockets of hatred that are associated, with basically I think the reason why we've been able to make these advances with LGBTQI rights is because most everybody has, some queer family member. So it's not an abstract. But with race, we have hypersegregation. And that the black folks that you have living in rural pockets of overwhelming whiteness, they it's too much of a burden to be doing this representation, right? And just kind of go along with the flow, and that then you have the white folks say, well, they're not like the others, and these horrible racist things, because they don't know the others, because they only see this family. It's like when I was doing field work in northern Minnesota. I was writing my book on the rainbows, and I meet the sheriff, and the sheriff is John Light, and he is a very tall, very dark-skinned black man in one of the whitest places I've ever been in my life, northern Minnesota.
Okay.
So I'm just like, wow, these people are kind of cool. They elected him for the last 18 years over and over again, elected him sheriff. And I came home and I told my wife, I go, wow, and there's this black man who's the sheriff. And she said, and you think that's not racism, right? Did they elect him comptroller? Did they elect him county executive? No, you want your cops to be scary because you're afraid of outsiders passing through. So they elected, it's like, okay. And then it goes with when I was in Guatemala talking to people and they were warning me not to go to Belize, living in Guatemala, and they're telling me not to go to Belize. Why not Belize? Es la tierra de los negros, right? It's the land of black people. I go, so what's wrong with that? And they go, Micheal, right? What's wrong with you? Don't you understand? I go, no, I don't. And then they told me black people are dangerous. And I in the States, I live in a black neighborhood. Where do you get this idea black people are dangerous? And they're like, don't you watch TV? Well, yeah, what are you watching? Right? And they were watching Hill Street Blues. It might have been NYPD Blue, I forget the time frame, right? Right. So we'll look at NYPD Blue. NYPD Blue is supposedly groundbreaking because you have, the smartest guy in the room, this black lieutenant, right? But he's also scary. He's a cop, right? So, you still have, among liberals who think they're changing the media, you still have the same baggage. So, yeah, I'm hopeful, but man, we got a lot of work ahead of us.
You brought up microaggressions. We only got a couple of minutes to go, but I'm interested to hear about some of your insights about that, because that, I think, is another big part of this conversation, that hopefully will continue on for a long time to come. But something that, again, a self-analysis that's needed to understand microaggressions, the things that we give off to each other. What can you tell us?
Well, I can't really in 3 minutes, adequately, talk about microaggressions other than something like, oh, I saw the pictures on your desk. Your family looks so nice. That kind of stuff, right? Which just cuts to the soul. Like, what do you expect them to be, right? So I mean, microaggressions. That's my 30 seconds on on microaggressions. Right. And again, it's racism. It's people are nice, and they can still be racists. Ibram X. Kendi talks about avoid using the term racist and just talk people, but talk about a racist action. And he'll say, like, even the most avowed racist at some moment in their life, some Klansman or some Nazi, at some moment in their life, they might have helped a black woman who was crossing the street whose shopping bag broke, or stopped to help somebody by the side of the road. That even the worst quote unquote racists might have done something anti-racist in their life for a moment, and that's, if you want to go back to hope, that's what we have to really look at, and that's the hook, in that people are not, the societies that evolutionarily survived were societies that were not violent, and societies that were open, and societies, so that there is hope, because it's been our history. Fascist movements always collapse on themselves. Their lies get too big. They turn against each other fighting for power. So there's hope. Microaggressions are just an example of how, people who really would be horrified if you told them that anything that they did was racist hurt other people around them who they care for through insensitive things that they have no clue they're saying or doing, because racism is so much a part of our culture. It's foundational, and it's inside of all of us. So microaggression workshops are really interesting.
I bet they are, and perhaps maybe we can have you come back and we can go into that for a full hour some other time, huh?
Some other time.
I'd like that very much. Professor Micheal Niman of Buffalo State College, really appreciate your time with us this morning, and giving us a lot of insight for sure.
Well, thank you for having me. I learned that phrase, Terry Gross. Thank you, though, really.
NPR for lifelong learners, right? Yeah. For sure. This has been Buffalo What's Next. We're pleased to be along with you, of course, and we're here with you every day from 10 until 11. Don't forget that you can also listen to the rebroadcasts at night here on WBFO, and it's also available as a podcast as well, and find it online at our website, WBFO.org. This is WBFO and WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WOLN Olean, and WUBJ Jamestown, your NPR station.